Hello, everybody, and I hope you are having a spooky day. For at this moment, we are actually going to be making some astute observations of a very scary plane, and that is of the upcoming Magic the Gathering set, Duskborn, House of Horrors. A bunch of delightfully horrific oddities await. Horrifying creatures, also some enduring glimmers, some ways to keep hope and hopefully survive the horrors of the plane of Galvagoth's domain. And nevertheless, okay, let's actually just stop trying to do the Crypt Keeper impression here. So nevertheless, we're actually going to be talking about our top 10 cards of the upcoming horror theme set, which is modern horror to clarify, Duskborn House of Horrors. Overall, I do think the set actually looks kind of cool. There is actually a lot of cool, spooky shenanigans, and even a lot of fun little jank brewing opportunities. Some fun new mechanics to toy around with. I kind of actually can't wait to actually toy with the cards in the set. And we're going to be talking about our top 10 cards of that specific set. But before we do, let's actually talk about our honorary mentions. Mostly for me, I think the one honorary mention I will mention here is I have to talk about Nico. I think Nico is actually a really cool card in the set specifically. Being able to make those shard tokens just helps out with the upcoming Eerie mechanic, which essentially is Constellation with Upside is the basic way to describe Eerie. But just being able to get those shard tokens, trigger the Eerie triggers or Constellation triggers if you're playing this in older formats, very nice. But also it's just a nice kind of like cool commander brew around where you don't want to go too crazy on ETB shenanigans. Sure, you might want to have some because, of course, the factor that, you're going to flicker. But the fact that you flicker a creature and then your shards would then become token copies of the creature that gets flickered, that's actually a very powerful effect, especially since there's a lot of good creatures with powerful attack triggers. Heck, maybe even some that we're going to be talking about in the set. Wink, wink, nod, nod. So yeah, I do like Nico a lot. I do think this is going to be a fun commander to brew around, but also just going to be a fun one to toy and see if we can make work in Standard. Other than that, we also have to talk about Tyvar. Tyvar is just a ridiculously fun card in general. Just being able to be a 3-mana elf that has the very powerful, kind of like Crater Hoof, but not like Crater Hoof's ability. Activated ability is very strong. But also that tap ability to give itself indestructible and such is also a really strong effect. Also, it's going to be very beneficial with the upcoming Survivor mechanic, which we'll talk more about that later when we talk about one of the cards that are very good that has Survivor. We'll get to that one. Oh dear, we are going to get to that one. But yeah, Tyvar, also just, I have to say, just... Okay, we'll also throw one more card in the honorary mention because I feel like I have to talk about these two. We also have to talk about Simone. Just Simone is actually kind of like a fun brew around as well, just being able to mess with the prime numbers, which makes it where you have to play a ramping strategy, but you don't really want to ramp too hard because you still want to get the benefit of the ever incremental big token that is affected by prime numbers, which is absolutely hilarious. But I gotta say, as part of the story, these two were actually essentially had to cooperate together to survive the house in the story. And I have to admit, that is probably one of the best parts of the story. Just seeing their discoveries of the house and how it works, just essentially being able to try to survive. And of course, we have to talk about the one powerful quote, which is, "The power of math," which, oh dear, I mean, every Vorpals person is going to meme that till, let's just say, a while. So yeah, I have to admit, it's just, all these are my honorary mentions, which they are cool cards, and also are part of the rescue crew that essentially was going to help save Nashi. Maybe we'll talk about them later. Wink, wink, nod, nod, as well as some other characters. But nevertheless, that's a little bit of foreshadowing. Let's now go step into the house and hope that we survive. Bada beep, bada boop.
Number 10.
So, first up, my number 10 card on the list, and this one we're actually going to be introducing the new mechanic in the set, which is the room
Oh, hi, Mark.
mechanic. Now, for those who don't know, let me give you a quick pointer on how rooms work. They're essentially kind of like split cards, but instead on instant sorceries, they're on enchantments. You have two sides of the card. one side and another side with different mana costs. Essentially, when you cast a spell on the stack, you can choose one of the sides to cast, you spend the mana, and then that side is unlocked while the other side is locked. However, later in the game, if you have the mana, you can essentially spend the mana while it's on the battlefield to unlock the door and essentially have both good, potentially very powerful effects on the battlefield. Including the one that we're going to be talking about at the moment, which is the walk-in closet in the Forgotten Cellar. Where do I begin with this? Okay. Now, first of all, the left side is a very, very good card. That's a Crucible Worlds. Crucible Worlds is a very powerful effect both in EDH as well as other formats. Even in constructed city card formats at times, it can be a pretty good card. But then we have to talk about the Forgotten Cellar, which, for those of you who are not familiar, this is a Yawgmoth's Will. Yeah, when you unlock this door, you get a Yawgmoth's Will for a turn, which is, you know, for 5 mana, it's maybe a little bit much, but the fact that we're in a very heavy ramp standard makes me kind of look at this card with a little bit of caution, because, Yawgmoth's Will is a pretty powerful card, but hey, at least we don't have Storm. Oh no, wait, we have Rouse Ultimate in Standard. And the thing that makes this card a little bit more absurd is the fact that with runes, we have a couple cards in the set, specifically Miranda, as well as a key, I think, in the set, like Skeleton Key or something like that, I don't remember the exact name. Well, it gives you the ability to lock and unlock doors. So technically, the thing that I think a lot of people are going to be sleeping on this Yawgmoth's Will is the fact that either through the locking or unlocking mechanic, or if you, like, say, for example, copy the room and then you unlock the copy, which, okay, one clarification here, since people probably will need to know this for Constructed. If you do anything in a room, like copying it, or reanimating it, or flicker it, when it comes back to the battlefield, it comes back with both doors locked, which usually is a detriment, but on the fact that with this card now allows us to unlock the cellar again and then repeat a Yawgmoth's Will, that is a ridiculously powerful ability that I think a lot of people should not sleep on. So yeah, my number 10 card on the list, if this card can find a home, it's going to be probably one of the more powerful cards in the deck, and that has to be the Walk-In Closet and the Cellar. Oh dear, we have a Yawgmoth's Will and even the potential Storm back in Standard. That's nuts, y'all. Number 9 on this list, and we're actually going into another room in the house for this one. And we just gotta talk about this very powerful room, which is the Charred Foyer and the Warped Landscape. Personally, I think this is probably one of the more powerful rooms in the set. Obviously, besides the one we mentioned before, but I think they're kind of tied, if I'm being legit honest. But ridiculously absurd card. Just being able to get the Impulse Draw is just modest for 4 mana, don't get me wrong, but let's talk about the Warped Landscape. Being able to make your exile spells, at least cast one of them for free, is a ridiculously powerful effect. Like, you really should not sleep on that effect. Like, the fact that it works on any card that's cast from exile, that's including your adventure spells, that's also including a variety of ways to essentially impulse draw in Magic, which there is a ton. So just being able to, for example, cast your adventure spell, then cast a creature portion for free, without a sweat, very powerful. And just, yeah, this is a ridiculously absurd card. Like, I think a lot of people are going to find out quickly how easy this can stack, and we're not even talking about the fact that if you have multiple copies of this in play, that allows you to stack the free casting triggers, which, that can get out of hand very quick. So yeah, number 9 on this list, a very good Foyer with a very, let's just say, entertaining view. Number 8 on this list, and this one is actually going to be kind of the more cuter inclusions in the list, and not just because they're all cute critters that actually can be a little bit sticky, and that is the Enduring Cycle. It's a whole monocolored cycle of these creatures that essentially have powerful static effects that more or less are cute little critters, but then when the critters die, they actually will return back to the battlefield as enchantments. We got a variety of good ones. We got a Cryptolith Rite that's on an enchantment. We got a Sanguine Bond. We got even stuff like coastal piracy. We even got one that's essentially an ogre battle master that's a good doggo, which, hey, you have to admit, you gotta love a good doggo. Now, nevertheless, all of this are very powerful, mostly because they're enchantment creatures, which then can trigger stuff like Eerie as well as Constellation, and even when they die, you can get a re-trigger of the Constellation Eerie, but also all these are very powerful constructed effects, that just being able to put them on an enchantment creature is very nice, so you can swing in, but even when they die, as long as they don't die by exile-based means, aka Sunfall, yeah, we're still gonna have to deal with Sunfall, should be able to get them back on the battlefield without a sweat and still have the goodness of their static effect. So, yeah, it's cute to have these cute critters to help us through the horrors of this house. Speaking of which, moving on to the next card, which is...
Number 7.
Number 7 on this list, and you better watch around the corners, because like in any horror film of the slasher variety, you got yourself your unstoppable slasher. Overall, this is actually a ridiculously absurd card, just being a very sticky creature that's very hard to remove. Just the fact that you have to use 2 removal spells on this, ridiculously absurd, or an exile spell, I should also clarify, can also remove it. But let's be frank, a lot of opponents are going to have circumstances where they'd be like, oh, I'm going to have to cut down and then use a go for the throat on this if I want to actually remove this. But alas, we wouldn't be talking about this card if it weren't for the factor that it was just sticky. There is also the factor that it is a 2 for your Death Touch with a very powerful Saboteur damage trigger, which is, of course, if you deal damage to your opponent, they lose half their life total. Yeah, that's gonna be a lot of life loss very quick, to be quite frankly honest. Like, if you found a way to give this, like, double strike, then it gets ridiculously absurd, because it's like, let's say, for example, if you get this double strike and you're at 20 life, if your opponent's at 20 life, you first do the first strike of damage, they're down at 18, then they lose half their life, they're down to 9, then the second double strike damage happens, they go down to 7, they lose half their life, then they're down to 3, and of course, if you're able to deal 1 more point of damage to them, as stated before, they go down to 1, and half the 1 is 0. So, yeah. Unstoppable Slasher, I think, is going to be a very popular card that people are going to try out initially, just because the temptation to being able to half your opponent's life total and deal a lot of damage, very tempting. As well as already mentioned, there is the combo with essentially, the giant demon, Aklasot something. The editor's going to show it here, but basically, it's the card that, more or less, when your opponent loses life, they lose, double that life. Of course, if your opponent's going to lose half their life, double their half is all their life. So yeah, that's also a combo, OTK combo without a sweat. So yeah, it's safe to say we got to talk about the Unstoppable Slasher and have to be very, very careful when they're on the battlefield.
Number 6.
Number 6 on this list. And honestly, I feel like we're going to be cheating a little bit again, but let's be frank, Valov is constantly cheating in the house, manipulating it with a variety of creatures to provide constant fear to the survivors. So we can do a little bit of cheating here, and actually talk about one of those type of creatures that go around the house, which is the whole cycle of the Overlords. Now, basically, these are the monocolor cycle of very powerful enchantment creatures that have the new Impending mechanic. For those who don't know, Impending, essentially what happens is you can cast a card for its alternate cost, the Impending cost. It enters in the battlefield as an enchantment with these, essentially, time counters on it. Then at your end step, you remove them, and once all the counters get removed, bada beam, bada boom, you have these powerful creatures that have both powerful ETBs as well as powerful attack triggers. These are very similar to those who have been in the history of playing a previous core set, very familiar to the Titan cycle. And all these cards, honestly, are very powerful. I mean, there's one that allows you to deal 4 damage, which, it's kind of like the least exciting of the bunch, but still 4 damage is nothing to sneeze at. There's also the one that essentially allows you to mill some cards and be able to return a creature or planeswalker, which I think that's going to be perfect in the Insidious Roots deck, because hey, you're getting a creature from your graveyard, you trigger Insidious Roots, you get a plant. The one that allows you to draw 2 cards and then mill essentially 1 card by discarding it. Great. Well, actually, wrong terminology there. I should say draw and then discard. That one's good because it's also a flyer, which has evasion, which is perfect, so it can actually attack and more evasive to provide you constant card draw advantage. There's also the one that makes tokens, which essentially flying tokens. I mean, we all know how good Grave Titan is, so the fact that the Mono White just got their own Grave Titan that make their little tokens have flying is absurd. And of course, last, but I should say certainly not least, there's the one that's the hype of the town, the one Overlord that allows you to make a land token that is every basic land type. Which in formats that have the domain mechanic is, let's just say I am expecting a lot of, pretty much turn 3, turn 4 leyline bindings thanks to the everywhere land, which, yeah. Plus, there's also a lot of cute ways that you can actually get these out to creatures a lot quicker than what the impending mechanic foretold, I guess, for lack of a better word. There's cute tricks like, for example, you can like flicker the card, which then allows you to essentially let it enter and repeat ETB, but then it comes back in as a creature. There's even reanimation spells where you sacrifice an enchantment and then return as many target creatures with how many enchantments you sack. You see where you're going with this. Since the impending creatures are enchantments, you sack them, then you can return them as creatures. There's even the fact that with clone effects, if you clone the enchantment, it will be cloned as a creature. Like, there's a lot of scary ways to play with these cards, and I do think these are going to be some of the more popular cards from the upcoming Dustborn set. They're spooky, and they are Overlords, for sure. Number 5 on this list, and this one's pretty simple. This one is the Entity Tracker, which it is, as we know in Magic, a Enchantress. For those who don't know what the term means, essentially an Enchantress are these type of cards where either variants of it where either you cast or whatever enchantment enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card. And of course, this is our eerie iteration of this cycle, which is pretty nifty because we're going to have a lot of rooms to unlock. So the fact that once we fully unlock a room, we also get a card draw from it, perfect. The fact that it has flash, perfect. So that we can actually cast it our opponent's instep, and then next turn, cast maybe 1, 2, or a few enchantments, and then just use them as cycling spells to draw cards. Awesome sauce. And you should never sleep on Enchances. Enchances are good for multiple formats. So yeah, number 5 on this list, gotta be the Entity Tracker. Without a sweat.
Number 4.
Number 4 on the list, and it has to be the big bad himself, the one that made Dustborn into its existence along with Miranda, and it has to be Valov. Now, Valov is just a ridiculously absurd card. Now, yes, let's be frank, it is high mana cost, but let's be honest with ourselves, we're mostly going to reanimate this or find a way to cheat this in. But even then, if you can cast it late game, it's a ridiculously absurd creature. Just all that stat, the keywords, and even the static effect is ridiculously powerful. A lot of people are going to sleep on that static effect, but I think that static effect is really good. Like, there's the obvious, the fact that you can mill your opponent to essentially get those cards exiled and be able to cast them using life and such. But there's even some little cheekier things that I think make this a lot more applicable to even older formats like Legacy and Vintage. Like, let's think about this. Let's be frank of something that you see in Legacy Reanimator. You, of course, are going to, put this in the graveyard, turn 1 reanimate it. Yes, it costs a little bit of life, but you then are going to gain life back, but lifelink. But most importantly, due to the way how this card is worded, whenever a card goes from anywhere, including if the card got cast, that's including instant and sorceries, they will get exiled, and then you are able to spend mana to cast them. So, say, for example, that's essentially play I mentioned in Legacy, and your opponent decides to spawn with Brainstorm. Well, now that Brainstorm gets exiled, and now instead of your opponent having the Brainstorm to essentially be able to cast it from a variety of means that essentially opponents are able to cast spells from the graveyard, now you have access to that Brainstorm when you need to in a pinch. You can even Brainstorm at that moment once the card gets exiled due to the fact that it's an instant. Just like, there's ridiculously absurd potential with Valov, so, yeah, very good card, and if they needed to design a really good mythic for the big bad of the set, I think it's safe to say they did their job well. Including also the Commander Precon one, because, oh man, that Commander Precon one is... Oh, a lot of people are going to get hurt by that. A lot.
Number 3.
My number 3 spot on the list, and this one I feel like I had to cheat and throw in some Kamikawa Westerns in here, and that is both a combination of Kaito, the Wandering Rescuer, as well as the individual that they were rescuing, which is Nashi. So let's go through one at a time with this. First of all, let's start off with Kaito. Yes, it's the Planeswalker of the set, and this one is actually kind of a ridiculously cool design. Being able to give ninjutsu essentially to a Planeswalker is pretty hilarious, I'm not gonna lie. And there is enough good early game evasive creatures that being able to get this out on turn 3 should be relatively easy, and also has some pretty powerful effects. Being able to give you ninjas, essentially +1/+1 boost, doesn't seem relevant, especially since we don't have a lot of ninjas in Standard, other than the upcoming Nashi and Satoru, essentially. But keep in mind, we do have some cheeky shenanigans like Leyline of Transformation to essentially be able to make all of our creatures into ninjas, and then that just becomes a general lord effect on an emblem, which anyone who ever played with the 4-drop Gideon from Battle for Zendikar knows how relatively good that can be to have that emblem on a nifty pinch. Also, the other abilities are good: surveilling, drawing card, typical Planeswalker value, as well as just being able to tap a creature down and stun it down so your other creatures can attack. Very good. Next, Wandering Rescuer. This one is actually just, I feel like it's just going to be a mainstay in Convoke-based deck designs in general. Just a very powerful effect, just being able to tap down all your creatures, give them essentially hexproof when they're tapped down, because hey, tap creatures have hexproof, pretty nifty. Also, it's just a 4/4 double strike, which can hit for a lot of damage. So yeah, I feel like any creature-based deck designs, as well as any that are trying to use the survival-based mechanic, as in fact we're going to be talking about one of those cards very soon, would have very much a very good time with the Wandering Rescuer. And of course, the last one we have to talk about, well, at least that's technically live and not a electronic scroll, technically, is Nashi. Nashi, this one's kind of weird because it's kind of a... It's not really a card you want to throw in the rack deck, but it is actually a really cool design. Just being able to have a self-mill package, being able to return legendary creatures, as well as just enchantments. That seems kind of weird at first until you remember that this is a heavy enchantment set, including a lot of runes, so it's kind of a flavor win. Nashi is going around the house trying to find the scroll of Tamiyo and such. So it's kind of like a cute theme of just you finding the rune cards and such, which is, you know, you kind of have to admit, that's kind of cute flavor. But even then, I do think this card is more powerful than people take for granted. Just the fact that it can buff itself if you don't find anything. And if you do, remember, you can return any legendary, which there's a lot of powerful legendaries, as well as any enchantment. And let's be frank, there is a ton of good enchantment removal, enchantment with static effects, like a lot of really good enchantments in Standard that, sure, just being able to draw it by having it milled, not bad. Also, if you go into like a Sultai Insidious Roots deck, just being able to more or less, kind of like how we talked about with the impending, the black card on the impending cycle, being able to mill and then return a creature card to your graveyard using Insidious Roots gets you some plant tokens, so that's really nifty. So nevertheless, my number 3 card on the list, it's 3 cards, and it's got to be the Kamigawa Trio. Let's be frank.
Number 2.
Number 2 is actually a pretty cool card, and yes, I did have a little bit of pun on this one, because it's one of the first times we had a card like this, which is a sequel. We all heard the scares and the horrors of Meathook Massacre 1. Now we get to see, well, depending on who you ask, either the better or worse sequel of the bunch, and that is Meathook Massacre 2. Overall, the fact that I have this on the number 2 spot on the list, as well as for the pun, I also have this on the list because it is actually a pretty powerful card. Now, let's just get this out of the way. It is definitely not as good as the original. Let's just get that out of the way. It is not a powerful board wipe that allows you to get a lot of life, as well as make your opponent lose a lot of life. It is not that type of card design. Let's just get that out of the way. But let's also keep in mind that the original Meathook Massacre was banned in Standard, and they really did have to have a slight nerf version of the card, if we're being quite frankly honest. However, However, I still think Meathook Massacre 2 is still a very strong card. Sure, it is technically a very, very expensive edict, but while the edict is a nice cherry on top, I think here we're going to be playing this for the fact of the very powerful static effect that you get with the card. Specifically, when a creature you control dies, you actually can pay for your life, and if you do, you get to return that creature back to the battlefield under your control. That is actually a ridiculously powerful ability for a variety of reasons. I mean, one that I can think of right off the bat is, well, I don't know. It seems like Standard has a lot of powerful ETBs at the moment. And yet again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but Atali's, Enchances, we all know them. So essentially, including the impending cards we talked about have ETB triggers. So being able to more or less, if you want to more or less maybe put a lot of mana into the Edict, you don't have to worry about essentially sacrificing one of your own creatures because, well, hey, you just get the benefit of bringing it back and repeating a very powerful ETB trigger, which is pretty silly. And that's not all, folks, because your opponents also have to have a very, very tricky decision of deciding, okay, do I want to spend free life, or do I want my opponent to have my shield rent? Or, yet again, all the ETB creatures, as we mentioned before. And yet, your opponent's going to be smart. Like, if it's more logical for them to pay the life, they are going to pay the life. But let's be frank, we're playing mono black. There is a lot of ways, including even the upcoming Dustborn set, to get your opponent down to a, dare we say, questionable life total, that it does make it a little bit of a tricky decision, definitely in mid to late game, where your opponent has to decide, oh, what am I going to do? And I feel like just by that aspect alone, I feel like makes Meathook Massacre 2 a pretty good card. As regarding to sequels, it's kind of like Halloween 2. Is it as good as the original? Absolutely not. But it has its own unique little charms and ways to essentially view the piece that you actually will appreciate it for its own merits. Now, nevertheless, at least it's not like, oh, at least it's not one of those. At least we could say it's not a unwanted remake.
Number 1.
Oh, what is my number 1 card of Dustmore and House of Horrors? Well, some could presume that it's going to be a big, scary monster or a very powerful enchantment. And the card is definitely powerful, and it is technically a beast, but it's more of a beastie, which in this case it's Kona. Kona, oh dear, Kona is a ridiculously absurd card. It's a 4-mana legendary that essentially has a survivor ability, which I think this is the first time we talk about survivor. Basically, it's a mechanic that if you, during your beginning of your second main phase, if the creature had survived combat and is tapped, aka second main creature is tapped, you get a survivor effect from the card. And what do you get from Kona? Well, you get to cheat a permanent into play. No restriction, no mana restriction, no, like, any ifs or buts on what permanent you can cheat in. You can cheat in anything on turn 4, such as, oh, I don't know, Portal to Phyrexia, Atali, Atratza. I mean, I could go on. I mean, for Pete's sakes, in a few months when Foundations come out, our core set that's going to be lasting for 5 years, we're going to have Omniscience. And even people have been talking about the variety of ways you can actually easily get Kona attack without having to attack, which, you know, that would be one of the cons. That would be like, oh, Kona has to attack, and then when it attacks, it will probably die to the combat. No, not exactly. There are actually a variety of ways coming into Dustborn, as well as stuff that's currently in Standard, specifically things like activated abilities on creatures that tap other creatures down to get an additional bonus effect. We even have Relic of Legends. A variety of things can actually easily tap Kona down without having to risk that little beastie in combat, which means, and there's even some speculation that once we get to Foundations and we have our mana dorks like Lenora Elves and stuff like that, that you could, in theory, with the right setup, be able to turn free cheapen any permanent that is a ridiculously absurd card to have on turn free. Like I stated before, list all the above. So yeah, this is one of the cards I'm more excited for because I'm kind of tempted to try this in my Naya Legends deck because I can implement packages to tap it down as well and just essentially be able to cheat in some really good permanents. Stuff like even as simple as Roxanne or, as stated before, Atali. So yeah, without a doubt, my number one card from Dustborn House of Horrors is this scary 4-drop. This 4-drop is going to do some shenanigans in some formats. Do not sleep on this little guy. Yeah. And that is my top 10 cards of Dustborn House of Horrors. So, personally, what are your favorite cards from the set? Let me know in the comments down below, and I hope you enjoyed this video. You all have a good day, as they say. Hip hip hooray. Well, at least as good as you could have in a haunted house, I guess. That is pretty much ruled by a giant moth demon. Sweet dreams.